It seems to me that Trump has worked out that he negotiated a bad deal.
Clearly, the potential for escalation in all sorts of directions is there.
What do you make of the idea of charging ships 20% of their cargo?
Embarrassing. I mean, this is embarrassing.
Trump has posted that he's decided to replace the 20% reimbursement fee with trade and investment deals that various Gulf states will be making.
Well, the Soprano family had lots of tools.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators with me, Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
And me, Mark Urban. Well, this is the podcast where we explore the signs that analysts look out for to help you make sense of a volatile world out there.
So, yet again, the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. And yet again, America and Iran are launching missiles and drones at each other in the latest sign that the memorandum of understanding, the deal which was meant to bring the war to a pause at least, just isn't fit for purpose. So what now? A never-ending cycle of tit-for-tat strikes, escalation, or are we about to see another abrupt U-turn with Trump hailing another deal that perhaps buys time, but not peace? In a few minutes, we'll be joined by former Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery from the US Navy to try and get a sense of what the American strategy is now. But first, Mark, what's your first indicator?
Well, the first thing I would flag up, which was a fascinating thing I saw earlier today on the kind of oil industry channels, was this estimate that during the 26 days that the deal did hold up and the US blockade was not in effect, it's gone back into effect today, the Iranians managed to export 30 million barrels of oil at a value of around $6 billion. So that gives us quite a good marker as to what they're going to be losing the longer the renewed blockade goes on. There was also the question under the memorandum of understanding, a sort of nod and a wink about unfreezing of assets, particularly in Gulf countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. And we think several billion flowed through by that method, although people deny it sometimes. But so the question now is, how many billions a week or a month will they be losing? And is that enough to change minds? Now, I'm interested in what you think about that, having been in Tehran so recently. I mean, I would say, I reckon it could change minds. I think the blockade was an important part of why the Iranians went back to the table at all in the sort of timescale that they did, having broken off the first set of negotiations with J.D. Vance. But of course, it's not going to happen quickly, is it?
Yeah, and it is hard to read between what Iranians say and what they think, because they're quite clever at this stuff. And obviously their argument has always been that we are structured as an economy to weather economic storms much more than the outside world. And so certainly while Iran has not had time to replenish its stocks of capital, the rest of the world hasn't had time to replenish its stocks of oil either. And so it is a question of, who is best set to weather a new storm if it goes on for some time. I mean, it seems to me that Trump has worked out that he negotiated a bad deal, and a deal that was always ambiguous and was always bound to lead to some sort of misunderstanding. And perhaps it sort of annoyed him because, it was clear that Iran was always going to see that memorandum of understanding as giving it de facto control of traffic through the strait. The memorandum was vague, but it did say Iran should take steps to administer the free flow of traffic. Now, it didn't say...
Open it up. And then after 60 days, should come up with Oman with a method, which you could say implicitly gave the Iranians what they wanted, which was the ability to get a proper status for this authority that would regulate the traffic through the strait. So in that sense, it looked like a win for them.
Yes, and obviously all of this is about where the two sides are when it comes to the next stage of the negotiations. And the Iranians know that if there is an alternative route through the Strait of Hormuz, they have lost their biggest weapon, their biggest source of leverage, which is control of the shipping. So, that's an incentive for the Americans to try and break their grip and an incentive for the Iranians to say, well, we're not going to let you. So it is hard to see either side giving in.
There was a short gap last week between a strike on a ship, and then the strike on the Cypriot container ship on Saturday evening, which triggered this latest American upsurge in aerial attacks. And during that few days, I saw reporting that the Iranians had communicated to the Americans, oh, this was some rogue elements that attacked those ships. I mean, is that credible in your view?
No, I mean, I don't see that it is. The Iranians will obviously want to be initially vague, but now they're being very, very straightforward, that they believe it is within their rights, within international law, to attack shipping that goes under American control. And we've seen that in the last day with these attacks on UAE ships hit by missiles. So it's very open now, and the Iranians, we had, one of the sort of the licensed people who speaks for Iran on the news last night, who was straightforwardly saying, we are now at war. And I think that goes very much with what we learned in the last couple of days about Trump's letter to Congress. On Friday, Trump wrote to Congress saying that, he was informing them now that America was effectively back at military action with Iran in what he sees as a new 60-day window under the War Powers Act, in which the president can act and use American military power without the approval or explicit authorization of Congress. And that, of course, follows both the House of Representatives and the Senate voting a few weeks ago to try and bring it to an end. Votes that Trump basically said he would ignore. But he had lost Congress effectively, and now he's saying, I'm going to start again.
It's fascinating though, isn't it? Because he, on the one hand, he does pretty much say, I'll ignore them. But on the other, he does, as you're suggesting, seem to be trying to work this 60-day window thing to his advantage so that he can continue campaigning without a so-called authorization on the use of military force type resolution.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he's written to them suggests that he intends for this to go on longer than we may initially have thought when these exchanges began a few days ago. So I think, it's been very interesting watching the markets react to this. Oil hasn't gone crazy, it's gone up, but we haven't seen the over $100 a barrel kind of prices that we saw when the war began in February. But I think because the markets thought, well, this must be a bit of sort of brinkmanship and something that's going to go away. It doesn't look like it's going to go away as quickly as they may have thought.
No. And the dynamics of this are subtly different from the previous round of this. So far, anyway. I mean, clearly the potential for escalation in all sorts of directions is there. So there's the potential for an escalation with the Houthis in Yemen closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to Saudi oil exports from their pipeline across the country to the Red Sea. I mean, the Houthis have said they'll do that. We're not quite sure what's happening there, though. There have been exchanges of fire. Saudis have bombed the airport. Houthis have fired missiles. Is that going to happen? Because you'd think that would be pretty bad for the Saudi oil exports. So in that sense, a worse equation for the world economy and the oil industry. But in another sense, in terms of regional stability, of course, the missing ingredient in this is that the Israelis are not in action. Clearly, their air force is very powerful. And I would guess that the Iranians would prefer to keep them out of it. But of course, if for some reason they don't want to and they want to escalate it, they've always got the option of getting Hezbollah to fire missiles into northern Israel again, which they've used a couple of times before.
And a couple of days ago, Israel did say it stood ready to attack Iran again. So it's not got there yet. And it's interesting in the Trump letter, he's very clear to say this is very limited. He says, United States ground forces are not involved in these strikes. These strikes are limited, measured, planned, and executed in a manner designed to minimize civilian casualties. So he's trying to signal that this is not a return to military action as it was in February, March, April. It is a much more limited exercise, but it could be prolonged. I think the other thing that we've got to, take more literally, I think, or take more seriously is what they say officially. And again,
This is Iran.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Ghalibaf, who is the man who has largely been leading a lot of the negotiation process, the Iranian speaker in parliament, who's regarded as having the authority of the supreme leader. I mean, he hasn't posted on X for a couple of days, but his last post is instructive. It says, the era of one-sided deals is over. We told you, keep your word or pay the price. Reality is knocking. And he posts a picture of point 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding, which said the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vehicles, reiterating their belief that that gives them control.
Yes, yes. And I think you may have referred obliquely to it, but last night we had the spokesman for the Revolutionary Guard Corps saying the time for restraint is ended, explicitly threatening, I think it was the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. Now, another wild card here, and we saw this with the Saudi strike on Sana'a airport in Yemen at the weekend, is how some of those countries behave. Because after the first round of fighting, we suddenly got all sorts of disclosures about the Saudis and the UAE flying undeclared bombing missions against the Iranians during the previous round of this that we hadn't really known about. I think we'd suspected that the UAE had done some, but to suddenly find out that the Saudis had flown, I think, hundreds of strikes was quite a revelation. And of course, if that promise from the Revolutionary Guard spokesman yesterday becomes a reality, that they do start much larger strikes against the oil infrastructure of those Gulf states, we don't know if they won't start retaliating against Iran too. So that's an element that I think Trump has only limited control over.
I mean, the thing that is still surprising to me is why the Gulf states are not more annoyed with Trump. In terms of them always being the ones who are in the firing line, and their economic model for the foreseeable future seems very, very threatened. Because if this is sort of a conflict that can come back periodically or extend for a long, long time, every time there's a disagreement over the negotiations, and if you look back at America's record over what happened in Gaza, there is no real reason to think that there's going to be a substantive negotiation that is successful in the near term. I mean, they haven't showed their ability to negotiate these things or to run international diplomacy in a way that gives you that kind of confidence. Why are they sort of tolerating this in the Gulf?
Well, they've sort of been on a journey, haven't they? I mean, I think initially when it all started, I think there was a sort of absolute shock. UAE in particular receiving more Iranian attacks than Israel was. And also, I think, a feeling among quite a few. I mean, a few weeks into the war, there was that article by Prince Turki, the former Saudi intelligence chief, who basically said the Israelis have dragged us into this and everyone's now paying the price. And, we've got to put national interest first. But I think the thing that curves it round a bit once the MOU is signed or was signed is that I think the idea of acknowledging Iranian control over the Strait is so abhorrent to those Gulf monarchies. I mean, it's very unacceptable to them. I think they're completely torn between some of them who would say, effectively pay the Iranians protection money and let's get on with this while we come up with other solutions like more pipelines. People have been talking about a railway across to the Mediterranean coast, all sorts of things, ways of avoiding the Strait of Hormuz. And other factions who say, no, let's hit them hard. If they hit our oil infrastructure, why don't we do theirs? And of course, as I said, the UAE have done some of that.
But you wonder how they will react to paying Trump protection money. Now, he, of course, a couple of days ago said he was going to start charging
20%.
ships 20% of their cargo, which is a huge amount of money. I mean, it could be $20, $30, $40 million per ship, which would have an enormous impact, not least on the price of oil around the world. Now, he has just, presumably under some pressure, said, well, I'm not going to do that anymore, but I'm going to find ways for the Gulf countries to invest in America through various investment schemes. So they're still being asked to pay up, even though they are the targets.
Yeah. And I think if he hadn't shifted on that, I mean, who knows how seriously it was. If he hadn't shifted on that, then if you're Kuwait or Qatar or whoever, you pretty quickly calculate it's cheaper to pay off the Iranians. Well, all sorts of questions there on the strategic level. But of course, there's also the issue of what's actually going on in the Strait itself. Is this operation militarily feasible? So earlier we spoke to Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies and a former US Navy commander. And we started by asking him the question about what exactly was the US military aim right now.
What do you think is Trump's thinking here? I mean, it is hard to see how restarting the war makes sense given everything that's happened over the last few weeks. What do you think is the rationale?
Well, I think this was an inevitable flaw in the memorandum of understanding, which is that the United States at its core, Trump at his core, did not, and he and his Arab partners did not want Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz. They read the MOU as giving them the ability to assert control over the Strait of Hormuz. So it's inevitable that there'd be this clash where the United States sets up an alternate transit scheme through what was historically the Southern or Omani transit scheme, now called the International Maritime Organization, or IMO Oman Transit Scheme, that the U.S. had gone through and validated that there didn't appear to be mines there, and can provide limited support against, particularly against, say, small boat attacks, but and limited support against missiles and drones because the ships are, some distance. The American warships are some distance away. So the United States is setting up this alternate route. It never got to the pre-February 28 levels, but if you added it together with oil crude that went through the Iranian scheme, plus the increase in the crude that went through the UAE and Saudi pipelines, we were very close to pre-February 28th flows. And Iran realized that's unacceptable to their idea of control. So, you have both of these countries creating conditions that were unacceptable to the other. So you're inevitably going to come down to, we're going to resolve this through U.S. military activity.
Do you think the calculus will have changed at all for the masters of those merchant vessels? I mean, we saw for months when the full-scale war was on that only one or two a day would even risk it. Has the US been able to sort of change the equation a bit in terms of exerting greater military naval control in that southern channel? Or is it still going to be a case of the masters one by one saying, we don't want to do this?
No, I don't think they've created the conditions yet. I think it's going to take a solid 2 to 3 weeks of an air campaign concentrated solely on the stretch, 150 miles from Bandar Abbas up to the midpoint of the strait to Bushehr, hitting that whole area, 50 to 75 kilometers inland, really hitting the 3 or 4 Iranian-controlled islands in the strait, to remove the capability to easily launch drones. I think drones are the real issue in this case, but and by drones I don't mean maybe the shorter one-way attack drones, but larger Shahed-style drones. They've got to remove that, and to do that, they have to do a concentrated air campaign to just do that. Then I think you could convince them. 1988, 89, when I did transits, the merchant ships just did what the U.S. Navy said. We're in a different world now, because of not just because of insurers, but because of the value of the load, the value of the ships, the value of future transits by those ships. They're loath to take the risk. So I don't know that you'll get the merchants following until there really is a clear sign of no IRGC response, or there's a change in Iranian overall behavior because the blockade begins to put another economic pinch on. They haven't gotten the benefit of the blockade being lifted yet in any meaningful way. And if we can reimpose the blockade, seize the ships that are en route to different ports, you can put economic pressure back on the regime.
And just talk us through it, because I mean, it's a field that the great majority of our listeners and viewers won't be familiar with. But you mentioned 1988, 89, and a lot having changed. One of the things that's changed is there are far fewer American-flagged tankers and merchant vessels. What's the issue with convoying non-US flagged vessels? Because apparently there are various legal and other issues that they can't do it, can they?
They can't do it as easily. look, when we did the convoys back in 1988, 89, some were U.S. flagged and some weren't. Famously, the Kuwaitis reflagged a lot of their LNG and other ships to come in and out. They reflagged them through a front company in Delaware, just temporarily. And that gave an increased ability for the U.S. to escort them. But in the end, other ships joined those convoys and safely got through. I don't think the United States would discriminate between what flag the carrier is. If a ship close aboard a U.S. Navy ship was under attack, the U.S. Navy ship's going to defend it you don't really know at 10 and 20 miles out exactly which target the missile's going to hit. So if an oiler's 1,000 yards away from you, it's going to get a collective air defense effort. So I don't worry about. I've heard that discussion. There is legal differences, but I don't think that's a legitimate reason not to do convoy ops. The reason we're not doing convoy ops right now is it would be a Wild West exchange of weapons still, in terms of the number of Shahed drones and a smaller number of cruise missiles. You can see from the attacks on the United Arab Emirates yesterday that they still have some cruise missiles left. The U.S. would have to fire a lot going back out. I think we want to reduce the risk before we kind of go into a non-consensual environment, attempt to do these transits through the Southern Transit Scheme.
If months of US bombing didn't stop the Iranians being able to fire drones at shipping, why do you think another 2 or 3 weeks will make the difference?
But that was months of U.S. bombing against probably 6 or 7 serious lines of effort. Actual ballistic missiles, ballistic missile production, actual drones, drone production, the rest of the defense industrial base, the ships, the small boats, the nuclear program, leadership. There was quite a few target sets in there. I think probably, in retrospect, incorrectly, we didn't focus enough on the aspects of drone launches in the Strait of Hormuz, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr area. So I think a focused campaign there, where you bring the full weight of Air Force and Navy strike aircraft, hit them 500, 600, 700 strike flights a day against those areas for 10 to 14 days, that would change the operational environment.
And what do you make of the idea of charging ships 20% of their cargo? I mean, protection racket springs to mind.
Embarrassing. This is embarrassing. The United States, for 240 years, since the Barbary pirates, the United States Navy has sought to maintain freedom of navigation alongside allies like the United Kingdom and others, and certainly for the last 80 years, almost single-handedly, to maintain freedom of navigation throughout the world so that the world can trade selfishly, because we benefit from world trade, whether it's finance, insurance, or the actual products themselves. We're the greatest beneficiary of world trade, and we've had a Navy that ensured that it occurred in a basis consistent with international maritime law. This is even before the United Nations Law of the Sea established it. And the United States, while it may not be an adherent to the UNCLOS, it's consistent with its practices in it. So the idea that we would suddenly start charging 20% is both contrary to our long-term national interests, and then secondly, from a personal perspective as a naval officer, embarrassing.
Quite. Now, you've talked about a 2-week effort, possibly longer, who knows? And of course, the effects of blockade could take a lot longer to really focus minds in Tehran. All the time, while that's going on, things can go wrong, can't they? We saw the tragic bombing of the school early on in the campaign. Then you've got the possibility that you lose an aircraft, or allowing the Iranians to capture pilots, or they seriously damage a warship. Can you tell us a bit more about how the uncrewed or drone systems are being used? Because we saw this week video released by US Navy of an uncrewed surface vessel going into the Iranian harbor to blow up a miniature submarine.
So you're right about your assessment of a blockade. It could take time. I hope we're smart enough to run down the Iranian vessels that have gone through over the last week and intercept them and divert them back to Iran or seize them when they refuse to do that. We need to have another hard conversation with India. I'd say have a hard conversation with China, but that won't go anywhere. China has never been a participant in any kind of international effort to hold like a rogue regime like Iran accountable. But I would seize and blockade any Iranian shadow fleet ships heading to deliver sanctioned fuel to either of those countries. So that's the first thing I do. And you're right. I can't tell you how long it'll take. I do think that there are clear structural weaknesses growing in the Iranian economic system, a mix of both the blockade and a significant bombing campaign that I mentioned earlier. So I do think you can get pressure on them. Again, I can't give you a date certain that the impact is clear. I do like that the United States has moved to USVs. Kind of 3 weeks ago, there was that story of the helicopter being shot down and the pilots being rescued by an unmanned vessel, which is pretty cool and unusual. And I would have not had that on my bingo card of things I'd see, during this event. But the unmanned surface vessels, I did expect to see. I know we've been developing them. I'm in Ukraine right now, where I spend a lot of time with their maritime brigades and some of their security brigades, who have made an art of this. They basically denied Russia sea control in the Black Sea, and in fact pinned the Russians, their military, deep in the Sea of Azov, at ports far, far away from the battlefield. So this is we're not the first to do this. I wasn't surprised to see it. I think we're probably going to hit that mini sub with a litany of weapons. I think we wanted to test this one. We got a good test of it. And I'm confident there's more of these out there.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You'll be delighted to hear that in the last minute while we've been speaking, Trump has posted that he's decided to replace the 20% reimbursement fee with trade and investment deals that various Gulf states will be making into the United States. So he's got a different way of squeezing them until the pips squeak.
Yeah, well, the Soprano family had lots of tools.
Thank you very much. Well, there's quite a lot to pick up there, Mark, not least on his belief that a 2 or 3 week campaign could make a big difference. What do you make of what he was saying?
Well, I think his sort of basic point that, what we saw from 28th of February through the weeks that followed was a phased campaign. Obviously, you start off with hitting the means that the Iranians have got of shooting you down, radars and all the rest of it. And then you move on to the ballistic missiles they were firing at Israel and the Gulf states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they only got towards the end, towards all those cruise missiles, drones and other things in the Strait of Hormuz area. I think that's a sort of valid point. But equally, we know from before the war that they were said to have hundreds of drones and indeed sea mines in underground caverns. And we know from testimony that the commander of Central Command has given to the US Senate that they couldn't penetrate a lot of the Iranian deep shelters. He talked about that being one of the big lessons of what had happened earlier in the year, that the US needs better means of penetrating these Iranian missile cities, so-called, and weapons stores. So I think we can assume that there's still quite a lot there, and we've seen that in the last day with a couple of cruise missile strikes on ships going through. So that's the big question. I mean, you can suppress it to a degree, which means really making the people who are going to retrieve those from the stores so frightened for their own lives or whatever, or the loss of their equipment, that they decide to lie low for a day. You basically deter them from attacking that particular day. But it's very hard on such a long stretch of coastline, 150 miles, to maintain that constant threat to them.
I mean, we're going to see, I'm sure, a huge imbalance as well in the amount of munitions used, because the Iranians, from their point of view, only need to show that they can hit the Gulf from time to time and they can hit ships. And so they probably don't need a huge amount of weaponry, and to remove their ability to hit ships completely is going to be extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Now, as you pointed out, we have seen this new American weaponry used in the last few days, which is unmanned
surface vessels, USVs, so-called uncrewed. We're seeing, boats, aircraft, and these one-way kamikaze uncrewed vessels. These are all indicators of how nervous the Americans are of putting people in harm's way and getting downed pilots produced, for propaganda purposes in the center of Tehran or something like that. All of that has got to be a nightmare scenario for them, as indeed it would be to have one of their destroyers badly damaged, by an incoming drone or something like that. So those are all things they're trying really, really hard to avoid. So therefore only actually exposing the crewed surface ships and aircraft to danger for fleeting periods. And when something bad happens, like the helicopter comes down, being able to go in and rescue their people, if necessary, using uncrewed vehicles as well. It's extraordinary. It's a big change in the way that campaigns are being mounted, that's for sure.
One final indicator I would just mention, which is one that makes us realize this is not just a far-off war, is that although the price of oil hasn't gone above the high $80 a barrel yet, what is edging up is the cost of government borrowing. We've seen US Treasuries and UK government bonds going up again, UK government bonds up over 5% yield. And that shows that although there isn't a panic about an oil price shock right now, there is a fear that this could be a prolonged problem that causes prices to rise over a period of time, and the markets are a little bit nervous. And that is going to cause a big headache to one Andy Burnham as he comes into power, because the cost of government borrowing going up means he has less headroom, he has less to play with. The recent reports that the Iran war had not quite caused the damage to the British economy that they had feared it would kind of goes away, because it could yet.
Just to clarify, that's not a Burnham premium we're now paying on bonds. That's not the market thinking this guy is going to be profligate with public money.
I don't think so.
Gulf
yet.
related.
It's Gulf related. It is pretty. You look at the timeline. It's basically in the last 24 hours.
Right.
It's gone up because the war has been resumed.
Exactly.
There may be a separate effect. That remains to be seen.
Oh my lord.
But the idea that this is not going to affect us back here is, I'm afraid for the birds. It will, and it will affect government spending.
We sometimes like to end on an optimistic tone. There we are doing the opposite. But I think we must bring it to a close.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for watching. Until the
Thank
next
you.
time, bye-bye.